In this episode of Small Group Life, we've been studying the idea of mission. Well, this week's study is on the notion of discomfort. But that word doesn't roll off the tongue very well. You kind of have to lurch into it. When you say discomfort, you feel your shoulders shrug up. There's something that forces you to say it. And it's very much and very illustrative of the Christian life, that when it comes to mission, we have to be forced into it. There has to be an external pressure that gets us into the mission of God, living missionally. That, of course, that's the Spirit of God. He helps us to see that there's something beyond ourselves. It's something that we have to move into, not a natural inclination. And so to be out on mission means we've got to move into different environment and into different spheres. And the Spirit of God helps us to see those places, go those places, and do those things that are part of God's mission. You know, as I think about living missionally, obviously John the Baptist comes to mind from our study. He had to live in discomfort. He should have been touted as someone who was an expert, someone who had been set apart for God's agenda. Instead, we find John the Baptist living outside of the city, all alone. He's wearing camel hair clothes. He's got a leather sash for a belt. For dinner, he has bugs and wild honey. And he goes up to the religious professionals of the day who are supposed to know what they're talking about, and he calls them broods of vipers. But the one that's from Nazareth, this new rabbi, Jesus, who we know as the God-man, he points to him and he says, "Here's the Lamb of God. Here is the sacrifice for all of us. This is the one whom I'm not even worthy to bow down and untie his sandals." John the Baptist lived in discomfort in the mission because he had to go against the powers that were normal in the environment. He had to live what Paul called us to live, and that's as ambassadors for Christ. When Paul writes this letter in 2 Corinthians to this local church, he tells them, you've got to live as an ambassador for Christ. And that sounds like a great gig. You get to go to another country, you get to live abroad. But think about it for a moment. Even though you go and you represent the power of the kingdom, the power of the government, you have to live in a place where they speak a funny language, wear funny clothes, and eat weird food. In effect, what you've done is you've left behind all of your preferences at home. And it has thrown a monkey wrench into your system. And sometimes you feel like you're throwing a monkey wrench into theirs. You are being pressed by God to live in a new place, to live in a new way. Recently, my wife visited the poorest country in our hemisphere, Haiti. And while she was there, a group of children gathered around her team, and there was this one particular little girl who was about 10 years old. She was bright and quick-witted. She had that beautiful, dark Caribbean skin. And just making conversation with these children, one of the ladies asked this little girl, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And she looked at her, and without hesitation, she said, "I want to be a white American." There was a lot of discomfort in that moment. Because suddenly, it wasn't about taking our culture, it wasn't about trying to help a child change ethnicity or nationality. They had to make a choice in that moment, in that environment, to be on mission, to show value in that person's life, even in the midst of their squalid conditions. But when we move out on mission, we have to decide what kind of perspective are we going to have. When we hear about John the Baptist's life, it's a man living in the wilderness. And the wilderness sounds very much like the missional life. It is overbearing, or it's barren, or it's thorn bushes, or it's jungle. It's the place that we want to escape from. But instead, we need to have the perspective of Christ when he looks out over the earth, as he looks out over his own city, and he weeps for it, that it's not the wilderness to escape, but it's the wideness of God's mission. It's the great view of everything that God is doing. And so as you and I look at our lives and consider living missionally in the place where we work, in the place where we live, and in the places that we can go, we have to decide, what perspective am I going to take with me? Is it going to be the wilderness that I got to get in and I've got to get out, I've got to escape from? Or is it the wideness of God's agenda that I can see in this place where I live and in these places that I can travel? So let me ask you today to consider really carefully, what are the preferences that you are choosing over the priority of God's agenda? What are the things that you want to stay comfortable in that hinder you from living missionally?